Welcome, everyone. Let's welcome Daniel Keer to EUC World Virtual. He is going to talk about from hours to minutes, Intune app deployment made simple. And for any questions, please put them in the chat and I will get to those so Daniel can answer. And with all that, over to you, Daniel.
Thank you. I gotta make my clicker work. There we go. Welcome. As Jarian said, I am Daniel Keer. I am an Omnissa Tech Insider, as well as a VMware vExpert. I am the project lead and senior consultant over at Digitally Accurate, where we do virtualization, VDI, and Microsoft things. I also run the blog, thedxt.ca. You can find me on social media on pretty much everything with the handle thedxt. All right, let's get into how we can convert hours into minutes and how we can regain some time. So this session, the full super long session title is From Hours to Minutes into an App Deployment Made Simple. In this session, we're going to cover how to deploy applications, how to figure out what the installation switches are, how to package them, and how to simplify the overall update process. We will also have a demo of how to create an installation script. And at the core, we will learn how we can regain some time in our day. Warning, this presentation uses QR codes. All right, let's get into application delivery. Now, technically speaking, you could do it manually, but let's face it, we all don't have time to do it manually, so don't do it manually. Now, you could use Winget. There's a lot of arguments to use Winget. However, Winget has its own set of issues. Here's an issue that I ran into personally, which was installing Microsoft Office, and it was due to the hashes of the Office installer not matching. So I have some trust issues when it comes to Winget that it's not perfectly reliable. Like most of the time it works. Now, if you work in IT at like an MSP or even in-house, a lot of times you'll have a remote machine management solution, and you can leverage those because they do have some app deployment features. But the thing that I would warn you of is maybe upper management might all of a sudden say, we're changing RMMs, and now you have to redesign your entire flow. And that's not always super fun. So I wouldn't put all your eggs in the RMM basket. Now, there are dedicated tools out there that can deploy applications. However, a lot of them come with a cost, and maybe there's not enough budget for that just to deploy an application, which may be why you might be doing it manually. Well, one of the things that you can do is use Company Portal with Intune. So a lot of the Office subscriptions, if you're running Business Premium or E3 and higher, then you likely already have a license for Intune. So one of the cool features that Intune has is a thing called Company Portal. If you've ever used SCCM, it's basically the Intune version of Software Central. And if you've never used either of them and you have no idea what I'm talking about, the short version is Company Portal is an application you can deploy on end user workstations. And what it allows you to do is to let a user install an application. And the benefit is, even if the user doesn't have admin, you can actually just install the program using Company Portal, and it will install with admin permissions, but without even elevating the user. So it's a very easy way for IT to push applications to users and let users install their own applications whenever it's needed. If you want to read more about how to deploy Company Portal, I have an entire blog post that goes into details on how you can deploy Company Portal. All right, now let's talk about installation switches. When trying to figure out how to install an application, you need to figure out what the install parameters are so that you can make it repeatable and also so that it has the desired config. Now, a lot of the times there will be application documentation on how to do it. Some applications have a ton of great documentation, but sometimes there are some niche applications that may be created specifically for the industry that you're working in that have zero documentation, and even the developers of it aren't sure of how to do anything. Well, If the application documentation fails, what you can do is when you're trying to install the program, feed it a command of /h or -h or literally gibberish, and you may actually get a helper prompt. In this specific case, this is the Omnissa Horizon installer, and I fed it a bunch of gibberish, and it spat out this very useful help command that tells me what the installation switches are. You can also use, even though that winget has issues, all of the winget packages are on GitHub, and you can browse those very easily. For example, this is the Adobe Reader install. And if you look in this, you can actually see what the install switches are that Microsoft's winget is using to install Adobe. So that's a very helpful way to find some of those switches. Another thing that you can do that I believe for the most part is kind of free is Chocolatey. If you look at the Chocolatey package and browse into the chocolatey install.ps1 and scroll in there far enough, like this is 200 and something lines down, but you can actually see what the arguments are that they're using. So you may be able to leverage that to figure out what those installation switches are. Also, a great tool is Google, is you can just Google it because the probability of someone else running into this problem is very high. Also, there's a really cool tool called Universal Silent Switch Finder. It's an old program, but it still works to this day, where you can just drop in an installer and it will attempt to identify what its packaging method is and what the silent switches are. In this case, this is Notepad++, and it's identified that it's using the NSIS package and that the silent switch is /S. Also, if you deal a lot with MSIs, you can use Orca to create a transform file to set the various parameters that you need for your MSI installation. All right, now let's talk about how we figure out the install logic. So the very first time that you are doing the install, you need to figure out all the switches that you actually need to make your install repeatable. You also need to be cognizant of if file names matter, because there was a specific case where an application vendor provided the install file, and if I changed the actual file name of the installer, the program just wouldn't install properly, and it was super weird. It's very rare, but it is something to be aware of. The other thing you should look at is if you can install an application on top. So what I mean by that is, for example, the Omnissa Horizon client. If you are running 2506, version 2506, and you want to install version 2512, well, lots of the times you may just uninstall the old version and install the new version. But a lot of applications actually have logic built into them that will figure out that the old version is installed and uninstall it for you and just kind of do all of that. So I would highly recommend that you test if that logic exists in the application or not, because most of the time it usually does. And another thing that you need to think about is if the application has licensing, like if you are deploying a specific corporate application that needs like FlexLM configuration or needs a config file or needs a serial number, you got to think about how you need to deploy that so that there's less end user frustration and just kind of user clicks it and everything is taken care of. All right, now let's talk about the downloads and how we can solve for them sometimes being slow. So to start off, PowerShell 5.1 is literally on everything right now, which is super awesome. And PowerShell 7 is slowly getting to every system, but it's not there yet. Now, technically speaking, as IT, you could just install PowerShell 7 on everything and just be done with it, but I don't believe in altering a system just to make my life a little bit easier. I'm going to leave it with the defaults. So when you run PowerShell 5.1 and you tell it to download something and you run it headless, it actually can take longer. So in this specific case, I'm downloading a 512 megabyte file and I am running it headless, and it's taking 5 minutes to download a 500 megabyte file, which is kind of crazy. And if you were to run it as PowerShell 7, the exact same script, it's just loaded with PowerShell 7 instead of PowerShell 5.1, well, it takes 30 seconds. Also, a tidbit is if you do PowerShell 5.1 using PowerShell ISE, you won't run into this problem, but as soon as you save your script and try to run it headless, then you will. Now, fortunately, It's kind of a bug, but not. There's a whole GitHub issue about it, and there's a lot of debate, but there's a very easy fix. And that is if you set your progress preference to silently continue, then when you run a download, it will take 30 seconds with PowerShell 5.1. What seems to be happening behind the scenes is that on PowerShell 5.1, when the progress preference is in its default state of continue, it's actually trying to render a progress bar to figure out how long it's going to take. But it seems that when it's running, it's only running on a single thread. So now it's trying to calculate how much download time it's going to take and how much it needs and do the actual download itself. Whereas PowerShell 7 just kind of ignores that when it's running headless. But if you set progress preference to silently continue with 5.1, then you can kind of solve the problem, which is really great because if you package your install, well, then you can run into this problem where your downloads are slow. And this is how to fix it. I also have a blog post that goes way more into detail about all of this, which you can check out there. All right, let's talk about URL shorteners. So technically in your installation scripts, you could use long URLs and you could hard code them. However, I strongly recommend against doing that because there was an antivirus vendor that I was deploying the antivirus for on a bunch of systems. And I was naive and thought that they would never change their URL. Well, spoiler, they did change their URL and they even put their installer inside of a zip file. And long story short, that's the reason why I ended up learning Python was to fix all my PowerShell scripts. But from that point forward, I vowed to never use a long URL that I can't control. And fun fact is that Microsoft loves to use short URLs. Here's a screenshot using Winget that is installing Microsoft Office, and its /configure parameter is actually pointing to a short URL, which points to the XML Office config. Now, there are a ton of options that do exist for URL shorteners like Bitly and tinyURL. However, if you ever want to make a change to those URLs, the problem is that they'll want to start charging you for that, which can be costly. I'm not actually sure how much either of those options cost. I just know there's a dollar figure. Now, fortunately, there's a fun open source project that is called Schlink, which is entirely free that you can just self-host and run it in your infrastructure, which gives you full control of any short URLs that you want and gives you just all the power back, and it's free. The other cool thing that you can do with it is you can deploy it with a Docker container. And if you do it with a Cloudflare tunnel as well, you don't need to open any ports just to make Schlink work. I have an entire blog post that goes into detail on how to deploy it. All right. So introducing the install matrix. The install matrix is an adaptable framework of scripts that a friend and I created. Instead, what we noticed was every single time we were creating an install file for a program, we kept just reusing the same functions. And rather than reinventing the wheel, we decided to publish this on the internet as the install matrix so that we don't have to keep trying to go back in old scripts to find the function that we were using. The cool thing with the install matrix is that it includes a ton of functions, such as like a downloader that will download the installation file, which has also recently been updated to set the flag to use basic parsing so that it's not impacted by the recent PowerShell 5.1 update. It also includes an installer function, which just deals with the application install. There's also an MSI version for dealing with those. And there is even a base64 function, because if you know anything about me, I absolutely love base64, and the world is full of base64. But if you need to put like a license file somewhere or a config file somewhere, a very easy way to do it is just encode the entire file as base64 and then just use this function to put it where you need it. It also includes a function to create shortcuts, as sometimes when you install an application and you are installing it as system, it doesn't actually create the shortcuts properly. So there's an entire function just to create shortcuts for you. As well as there was an application that when you installed it or upgraded it, it would like nuke out the user's app data for that program. So that was very annoying. So there's an entire function that will back up that program's or any program's app data, as well as another function to deal with the restoration of that. And most importantly of all, there is an install cleanup function in there because if you're anything like me, you probably have a ctemp folder that's like 10 gigs. And if you include the install cleanup function, well, then you can make it so your users don't have 10 gig install folders or temp folders. And that's just barely scratching the surface of all the scripts that are on the install matrix GitHub. And it's totally free to use. Here's a QR code that will take you to the GitHub repo. All right, now let's put everything together and go through a brief demo of how we can use the install matrix. So to start off, we need to set the defaults. So in this specific case, we're going to install the ALM toolkit, which is an MSI. It does something with Power BI stuff. I had to deploy it. I don't really know what it does. I just know I had to install it. The other thing that we're going to define is where the temp directory is. In this case, we're going to define it as ctemp. We're also going to define the installation arguments, which is going to be no restart and quiet no UI. And then we're going to get the current progress preference and store it as a value so we can deal with it later. And then we're going to override whatever it's set to and set it to silently continue to make sure that our downloads go fast. Then we will load in the get installer function that will download the actual install file. And then we will use the install MSI function to deal with the MSI installation. Then we'll load in the remove installer to get rid of the installer once everything is done. And then we're going to combine everything and actually call the various functions where we call the installer, and then we call the actual install, and then we clean up after everything is done. And at the very, very end, when it comes, we set the progress preference back to the original values. And when it comes time to updating, we actually don't need to touch the script whatsoever because we're using a short URL. So once you have this PowerShell script that is created, now you need to put it in Intune. And a great way to do that is the Microsoft Win32 content prep tool, which allows you to take a PowerShell script or anything for that matter. I don't think there is anything that you can't put into it. But in this specific case, I was able to take my global protect install script, which is a PowerShell script, and package it as an Intune Win file, which then I'm able to take that Intune Win file and upload it into Intune as my install. And it's 4 kilobytes. I have an entire blog post that goes a bit more into detail on how to deal with packaging a script with the Win32 content prep tool. And one thing to note is that inside of Intune, Microsoft recently added an option so that instead of using command line, you can use a PowerShell script natively. However, there have been some potential reported issues with it, which Microsoft may have resolved by now. But the issue is you still have to upload an Intune Win file. So unless you're uploading dummy files, your options are still a little bit limited. So I'm still going to keep doing the way that I've been doing because it works, but it's just something to be aware of. Now, now that you have uploaded the Intune Win file to Intune, then you need to figure out how to detect if the application is installed. Now, you can do that by using an MSI code. You can do it by looking at the registry. You can also use scripts, but you can use version info. And that's my personal favorite because with version info, here's an example where I am detecting the version of VMware tools. And what I'm doing is on version info, I'm checking if the version is greater than or equal to whatever the version number is. And the main reason why I'm doing that is that it will simplify my update process, as when I want to deploy a new version, I don't have to worry about if it's going to cause an infinity loop or just mass upgrade every single system. I can just tweak this later on. There'll be more on that later. All right, when it comes to your users, they recognize the icons and the programs that they use. Most users are always going to know what the Google Chrome or what the Outlook icon looks like. So when you're putting an application into Company Portal, it's to drive the user engagement. You need to make sure that you're using things that are recognizable to the users, so the users are more likely to kind of figure it out. Now, getting these icon files can be a little bit complicated, but fortunately, there's a bunch of solutions for that. One of them is Google. A lot of times you will be able to find icon files or just PNGs of the program. Now, if you're dealing with niche programs, sometimes that doesn't work. So there's this program called Icon Viewer, where once you have it installed on your system, you can right-click a DLL or an EXE or I think other file types too, and you can see all the icon files that are loaded in it, and you can just save those out and use those in Intune. Another fun tool is Nursoft makes a program called Icon Extract, and it can search your entire system and or just a specific directory and find you all the icon files for you and just search every DLL and EXE for you. Now, when it comes time to updating, well, we don't want to repackage the Intune Win file because we don't have time to do that every single time, and that is crazy. So one of the things that you want to start off by doing is testing the new version. Like test and see if the new version can install on top of the old version. Make sure that functions the way that you think it does. Most of the time it will. So then once you've tested that, all you have to do is go into Schlink or whatever URL shortener you're using, and then go in and edit what that short URL is so that it points to the new version. Now, that will only impact new installations because if the detection mechanism is set to greater than or equal to, well, then it will think that the program's installed and not be in an infinity loop. And then once you're ready to update all the systems, then all you have to do is just go in and change the detection mechanism to be whatever the new version is. So then all systems will start installing that new version because we don't have time to do everything manually. So to recap everything, what we covered was how to deploy applications with Company Portal and how we can deliver them to the users, as well as how to figure out what the installation switches are, how to think of our install logic to deal with the installation, how to make our short URLs with Schlink, as well as introduce the install matrix, and covered how we can package a script as an Intune Win file and what we can do to detect it, as well as how to give your users pretty icons. And most importantly, don't repackage for every single update because that's too much. There were a lot of QR codes in this presentation, so here's a list of all of them. Just kidding, here's a QR code that leads to a GitHub download or a GitHub page that has all of the different links, as well as a download for the presentation if you want. And now it is time for the quiz. I mean, questions.
So there was one that came in about is there any risk about using Software Center within the organization and blocking Microsoft Store to secure software installation within the organization? So any risk on that one?
If you're blocking the Microsoft Store, then you're going to run into issues deploying Company Portal because Company Portal wants to leverage the Microsoft Store. However, what you can do with Company Portal is you can download the offline version and then you can deploy the offline version. So whenever there's a new version, you will have to always manually go in and update that. But it is possible to do Company Portal without the Microsoft Store.
Any other questions? We have about 7 minutes left. If not, any closing thoughts, Daniel?
Nope, just wanted to say thank you to everyone that is attending. And if you're going to EUC World in Milwaukee, I will have a presentation about conditional access. So be sure to sign up for that.
All right. Well, thank you and look forward to the conditional access session if you are going to be in Milwaukee. Next up, everyone can go back to the lobby, and then at 35 after, we will have the Nerdio session before we get to our last block presenter. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Daniel, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.